Have you ever felt like you were giving so much in a relationship that you started to lose pieces of yourself? As we get older, the longing for love and connection doesn't fade. But what happens when that love takes more than it gives? Today's story is about Charles, a man in his 70s who found the strength to walk away from a toxic relationship and rediscover his dignity and happiness. If you've ever felt unseen or undervalued, this is your wake-up call. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more inspiring stories. Charles's story begins like a page out of a romantic novel. At 70, after dedicating decades to his family and responsibilities, he longed for a love that would reignite his passion for life. Meeting Julia felt like a blessing. Her vibrant energy and infectious charm seemed to awaken a side of him he thought was lost. For the first time in years, he felt seen, valued, and alive. But as the initial excitement faded, subtle cracks began to form. At first, they were small, playful suggestions about his appearance or habits. "Why don't you try wearing something more modern?" Julia would say with a laugh. Charles, eager to please, dismissed the comments as harmless. After all, wasn't love about compromise? What he didn't realize at the time was how these small remarks were planting seeds of doubt. Over time, Julia's playful tone shifted. Her comments became sharper, her expectations heavier. She started to criticize his hobbies, his routines, even his friends. "Men your age should really take better care of themselves," she said one evening, her words cutting deeper than she probably intended. For Charles, these moments were confusing. He told himself that her intentions were good, that she just wanted the best for him. Yet deep down, he began to feel a subtle shift in his own sense of self. The confidence he once carried was eroding, replaced by a quiet unease. His friends noticed the change first. "You don't seem like yourself these days," Martin, his longtime confidant, said during one of their coffee meetups. Charles brushed it off with a smile, unwilling to confront the growing weight in his heart. He wanted to believe that this relationship, this new chapter in his life, was worth any sacrifice. Even his children grew concerned. "Dad, are you sure this is what you want?" his daughter gently asked one evening. "You've already given so much to everyone else. Maybe it's time to focus on yourself." These conversations stuck with Charles. He began to notice how much of his life had shifted to fit Julia's preferences. His favorite jacket, dismissed as outdated, his usual routines, rearranged to accommodate her whims. Bit by bit, the man he once was seemed to fade away. And yet he held on, convincing himself that this was just part of love. The wake-up call came unexpectedly. One evening, after yet another critical remark from Julia, Charles found himself sitting alone in his quiet living room. As he reflected on their relationship, a painful realization washed over him. He had given up pieces of himself for the sake of keeping her happy. The joy and energy he once felt in her presence had been replaced by self-doubt and a lingering sense of inadequacy. In that moment, Charles understood that love shouldn't come at the cost of losing oneself. True love lifts you up, celebrates who you are, and never asks you to shrink or change to fit someone else's vision. This realization marked the beginning of a profound journey, a journey of reclaiming his dignity, his identity, and his joy. Charles's story resonates because so many of us have faced moments like these. The signs of a toxic relationship aren't always obvious at first. They can appear as playful suggestions, well-meaning advice, or subtle critiques. But over time, they accumulate, quietly chipping away at your confidence and sense of self. If you're watching this and nodding along, take a moment to ask yourself, have you noticed these signs in your own life? Are you giving away parts of yourself in the name of love? Remember, it's never too late to take a step back, reflect, and choose to prioritize your happiness. Charles's wake-up call can be yours too. The turning point in Charles's story wasn't marked by a dramatic argument or a single moment of clarity. It came quietly, in the stillness of a night that felt no different from any other. But for Charles, it was the moment he could no longer ignore the weight he'd been carrying for so long. That evening, Julia's criticism had been like so many others before it, sharp, dismissive, and laced with disappointment. She'd sighed over a simple misstep at a dinner party, muttering, "You could at least try to make a better impression." Charles, as always, had nodded, swallowing the sting and telling himself it wasn't worth arguing over. Yet as he sat alone in his living room afterward, her words echoed in his mind, louder than they ever had before. Looking around his quiet home, Charles felt an unfamiliar sense of disconnection. The walls were lined with reminders of a life he'd built, a life full of memories, achievements, and the quiet dignity of a man who had always lived by his values. And yet in that moment, he felt like a stranger in his own story. Charles's gaze fell on a mirror across the room. Hesitating, he stood and faced his reflection. What he saw made his chest tighten, a man worn down by years of trying to be someone he wasn't. The confident, self-assured man he had once been was gone, replaced by someone desperate to meet the endless expectations of another. His eyes, once bright with hope, now looked dull and weary. As he stood there, an undeniable truth emerged. He had given so much of himself to Julia that he barely recognized the man staring back. He realized that the sacrifices he'd made in the name of love had crossed a line. Love, he thought, wasn't supposed to feel this way. It wasn't supposed to hurt, diminish, or demand the abandonment of one's identity. The choice ahead was clear, but it wasn't easy. Walking away from Julia meant facing the world alone, admitting to himself that the relationship he had poured so much into had failed. The thought terrified him. What would be left of his life without her? Would he find meaning again, or would loneliness take its place? But then another thought surfaced, stronger and louder than the fear. What will I lose if I stay? Charles knew the answer. Staying meant losing more of himself, his dignity, and the life he had worked so hard to build. It meant continuing to shrink under the weight of someone else's expectations. And that realization gave him the strength to make the hardest decision of his life. The next morning, Charles called Julia and asked to meet. Sitting across from her at a cafe, he spoke words he had been afraid to admit even to himself. "I've spent so much time trying to be the person you want me to be, and in doing so, I've forgotten who I am. I can't keep doing this, not to you and not to myself." As he walked away from that cafe, his heart ached, but for the first time in years, Charles felt the weight lift. Choosing himself over the relationship was not giving up. It was an act of self-respect. And with that decision, a new chapter of his life began. Walking away from Julia was one of the hardest decisions Charles had ever made. At 70, starting over felt daunting, but staying would have meant losing even more of himself. The silence that greeted him when he returned home was overwhelming at first, a stark reminder of the void she left behind. For years, his life had revolved around meeting her expectations, and now, for the first time in a long while, he faced a life that was fully his own. At first, Charles didn't know where to begin. His days felt aimless, and he struggled to shake the weight of doubt and regret. But slowly, small changes began to take shape. One evening, while tidying the attic, he came across an old easel buried beneath a pile of forgotten belongings. Painting had once been his passion, a way to express himself when words failed. Julia had dismissed it as a waste of time, but standing before the easel now, Charles felt a spark reignite. His first strokes were hesitant, almost clumsy, but as he let his emotions flow onto the canvas, something shifted. Each painting became a reflection of his journey, his frustrations, his hopes, and his rediscovery of joy. The simple act of creating for himself without judgment reminded him of who he once was. It wasn't just about painting, it was about reclaiming something that had been taken from him, his happiness. Charles also began to rebuild connections he had neglected during his time with Julia. He reached out to old friends, people who had always valued him for who he was. Martin, his longtime confidant, welcomed him back with open arms and a knowing smile. Over cups of coffee and shared memories, Charles found comfort in the warmth of genuine companionship. He realized how much he had isolated himself, cutting ties with those who truly cared. These friendships became a lifeline, reminding him that he was never truly alone. Reclaiming his dignity also meant taking better care of himself. Charles joined a local walking group, a small but meaningful step toward physical and emotional healing. At first, he hesitated, worried he wouldn't fit in, but the group turned out to be filled with people just like him, individuals seeking connection and purpose later in life. The shared walks, laughter, and encouragement reminded him that he wasn't the only one navigating change. With every step, he felt his strength returning, both physically and mentally. He also began cooking for himself again, a task that had once felt like a chore, but now became a source of self-care. Experimenting with new recipes, savoring flavors, and enjoying the process reminded him that nurturing himself was a vital part of healing. It wasn't about impressing anyone else, it was about reclaiming his independence and self-worth. In quiet moments, Charles found himself reflecting on his relationship with Julia, not with anger, but with a desire to understand. Through journaling and introspection, he came to a profound realization. He had stayed in the relationship because he believed love required sacrifice. But love, he now understood, should never come at the expense of one's identity or happiness. Forgiving himself was one of the hardest but most crucial parts of his journey. He let go of the guilt for not leaving sooner and the shame of changing so much to fit Julia's vision. Forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past, it was about accepting it and moving forward with clarity and purpose. As Charles began to heal, he set boundaries for his future. He promised himself that he would never again compromise his values or passions for the sake of a relationship. These boundaries weren't about keeping people out. They were about protecting the life he was rebuilding. He learned to say no when something didn't align with his values and to prioritize relationships that uplifted him rather than diminished him. Perhaps the most surprising part of Charles's journey was how much he grew to appreciate solitude. At first, being alone felt like loneliness, but over time, it became a source of peace. Solitude allowed him to listen to his own voice again, to rediscover his likes, his values, and his sense of self without the interference of someone else's expectations. One evening, as he sat by his window watching the sunset, he felt a profound sense of peace. The silence that had once been deafening now felt comforting, a reminder of how far he had come. He smiled to himself, not with regret for the years he had spent with Julia, but with gratitude for the lessons her presence and eventual absence had taught him. Charles realized that walking away from Julia wasn't a failure, but a turning point. It had given him the opportunity to reclaim his dignity and rediscover his joy. By choosing himself, he didn't just survive, he began to thrive. His healing journey wasn't about forgetting the past, it was about embracing the future with open arms and a renewed sense of self. Through his courage and determination, Charles showed that it's never too late to heal, to rediscover your worth, and to live a life that honors your true self. Charles's journey wasn't just about walking away from Julia, it was about rediscovering truths that had been buried under years of self-doubt and compromise. As he reflected on his experience, he began to see his story not as a failure, but as a profound lesson about love, resilience, and self-worth. The first thing Charles learned was that love should never come at the cost of one's identity. In his relationship with Julia, he had slowly given up the things that made him who he was. His hobbies, routines, and even his confidence became casualties of trying to meet her expectations. At first, he saw these changes as natural compromises. But over time, he realized they weren't compromises at all. They were sacrifices, and they came at the expense of his sense of self. True love, he came to understand, doesn't ask you to change who you are. It celebrates your individuality, lifting you up rather than tearing you down. For anyone in a relationship, this realization is crucial. If you feel like you're losing pieces of yourself, it's time to step back and reassess. A relationship worth keeping will make space for the real you, not demand that you shrink or change. Charles also learned that self-worth is non-negotiable. For too long, he had allowed Julia's opinions to shape how he saw himself. Her criticisms made him feel as though he wasn't enough, and he began to question his value. But through his healing process, he discovered that self-worth isn't something others can define. It comes from within, built on the life you've lived, the challenges you've overcome, and the person you've become. Reclaiming his dignity meant recognizing his own value, independent of anyone else's validation. He realized that by tying his self-worth to Julia's approval, he had given her too much power over his happiness. Taking that power back was the first step toward rebuilding his confidence and reclaiming his life. Another powerful lesson Charles learned was that it's never too late to start over. At 70, he had feared that his best years were behind him. Walking away from a relationship that had consumed so much of his time and energy felt like a daunting leap into the unknown. He worried about loneliness and wondered if he could still find meaning and joy. But as he began to rebuild his life, he discovered that age was not a barrier to new beginnings. Picking up a paintbrush, joining a walking group, reconnecting with old friends, each small step reminded him that life still held surprises and opportunities for happiness. The wisdom and experience he had gained over the years made these new beginnings even more meaningful. Charles also came to understand the importance of boundaries. In his relationship with Julia, he had let her expectations dictate his choices, mistaking this as an act of love. But he realized that real love respects boundaries and doesn't require you to sacrifice your values or passions. By setting limits, he protected his well-being and ensured that his future relationships would be built on mutual respect and understanding. One of the most profound lessons Charles learned was the value of self-love. For years, he had poured all his energy into making Julia happy, neglecting his own needs and desires. It wasn't until he walked away that he began to see how important it was to care for himself. Self-love, he discovered, isn't about selfishness. It's about treating yourself with kindness and acknowledging your inherent worth. As Charles started to prioritize his happiness, he found that his life became richer and more fulfilling. Taking time for his passions, his health, and his friendships wasn't just healing, it was transformative. He realized that by nurturing himself, he had more to give to the world and to the people who truly valued him. Charles's journey teaches us that love should never tear you down. It should lift you, honor who you are, and bring out the best in both partners. If a relationship makes you feel small, it's not love. It's control, and it's not worth sacrificing your self-worth for. It also reminds us that no matter how old we are, it's never too late to make a change. Starting over may be scary, but it's often the path to rediscovering joy and meaning. Boundaries are not selfish. They are acts of self-respect. And above all, the most important love is the one you have for yourself. Charles's story is a testament to the power of resilience. Walking away from Julia wasn't the end of his life. It was the beginning of a new chapter. He reclaimed his dignity, rediscovered his passions, and found a deeper sense of peace than he had ever known. For anyone who has ever felt unseen or undervalued, his journey offers hope. You are enough just as you are, and the moment you believe it, you open the door to a life of true fulfillment. Charles's journey is a powerful reminder that it's never too late to reclaim your dignity and rediscover your worth. Love should build you up, not diminish you, and self-worth is something no one else can define for you. Whether you're starting over or simply seeking peace, remember that your happiness matters. Let Charles's story inspire you to take the first step toward prioritizing yourself. What lesson from his journey resonated most with you? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that inspire and empower. You are enough, just as you are.